The Resonance Matrix Vol. 2, The Linguistic Somatic Decode Episode 3 Instigation, When Urgency Becomes Motion. Hello and welcome back to the Resonance Matrix Volume 2. As always, this is not a space for persuasion, instruction, or correction. It is a space for noticing, for observing how influence moves through language, biology, and perception long before it announces itself as intention. In the previous episode, we explored dogmatism as the moment belief hardens into structure, when certainty becomes stable ground, and identity begins to anchor itself around what feels unmovable. That process brought solidity. It reduced uncertainty. It offered relief. But stability does not remain still for long. Where belief has hardened, energy begins to gather. Today, we move into the next phase of environmental grooming, not by introducing new ideas, but by introducing motion, not by challenging certainty, but by agitating it. This is the terrain of instigation. Instigation is rarely experienced as manipulation. It is experienced as an urgency. It arrives as a feeling that something must be done. That time is short, that inaction carries risk, that movement itself is the solution, even when direction is unclear. Before we name it, analyze it, or map it, we begin by recognizing a simple biological truth. The nervous system is far more responsive to motion than meaning. Once the body is mobilized, cognition follows. Reflection narrows, timing compresses. The space between stimulus and response, the ineffable gap, begins to close. Instigation exploits this property with precision. It does not seek to convince you of anything new. Instead, it injects energy into existing belief structures, turning certainty into momentum. Where dogmatism provides ground, instigation provides heat. Where belief once felt settled, it now feels activated. This activation often presents as concern, outrage, anticipation, or moral urgency. It may feel justified, it may feel necessary, it may even feel virtuous. But beneath the emotional narrative, a physiological shift is already underway. Breath shortens, attention accelerates, time begins to feel compressed. The body prepares to act before the mind has time to orient. Instigation thrives in this gap, the moment when motion begins before meaning is fully formed. It does not ask whether movement is wise. It asks only whether movement is immediate. Because immediacy feels protective to a nervous system scanning for threat, instigation often passes unnoticed. In environments already stabilized by shared belief, instigation does not need to argue. It only needs to disturb the stillness. A spark, a headline, a tone shift, a question framed as a warning. Suddenly, the perceptual field feels charged. Something is happening. Something is coming. Something requires a response. In that moment, the body leans forward. Throughout this episode, we will examine instigation not as aggression, but as activation without direction. We will trace how emotional energy is mobilized, how urgency bypasses reflection, and how reaction can feel like agency even when choice has already narrowed. This is not an episode about resisting action. It is an episode about recognizing when action is being summoned prematurely. As you listen, you are not asked to agree or disagree. You are only invited to notice when your system begins to feel slightly faster, slightly warmer, slightly less spacious. That is the signature of instigation beginning to work. From here, we will follow that movement carefully, calmly, and without rushing into the mechanics that turn still belief into restless momentum. The spark in the dry field instigation rarely announces itself as a force. It arrives as a disturbance, a barely perceptible shift in the air, the sense that something which was settled has begun to stir. Nothing has changed yet, and still, the nervous system feels it. A tightening, a readiness, a slight lean forward inside the body, as if anticipating movement before knowing why. This is how instigation begins. Not with instruction, not with belief, but with energy. A once stable field, organized by shared assumptions, hardened certainty, or familiar narratives, becomes charged. The ground is the same, but the temperature has changed. What once felt calm now feels alert. What once felt resolved now feels unfinished. Instigation is the moment when belief begins to hum. In many environments, this hum is mistaken for awareness. It feels like waking up, like finally paying attention, like caring more deeply about what is happening around you. And because it carries emotional heat, it often feels meaningful, purposeful, necessary. But meaning is not the same as direction. Instigation does not tell you where to go. It tells you that you must move. This is its defining feature. Where dogmatism stabilized perception by hardening belief into ground, instigation introduces motion without a map. It injects urgency into certainty, turning conviction into momentum before reflection has time to orient. The nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to this shift. Long before the mind forms a coherent narrative, the body begins preparing for action. Muscles subtly engage, breath shortens. Attention narrows towards signals that suggest threat, opportunity, or moral violation. Time itself seems to contract, the future pulls closer, the present feels pressurized, and hesitation begins to register as risk. Instigation feeds on this compression. It thrives in the space where action feels safer than stillness. A spark lands, and suddenly the field feels dry, not because it was barren before, but because it has been prepared, groomed by stability. Certainty has already done its work. Shared belief has already reduced ambiguity. All that remains is to introduce heat, and heat moves quickly. Often the spark is linguistic, a phrase framed as a warning, a statement delivered with urgency, a question that implies danger rather than curiosity. The words themselves may be simple, even familiar, but their timing carries force. Something is happening. Something is wrong. Something must be done. These signals do not need to be explicit. Instigation rarely uses commands. Instead, it relies on implication, on emotional suggestion that bypasses deliberation and activates readiness. The body receives the message immediately. The sympathetic nervous system begins to rise, mobilizing energy for action. Heart rate increases just enough to be noticeable. Breathing becomes shallow and quick, optimized for movement rather than reflection. The muscles of the jaw and shoulders tighten, bracing for engagement. Peripheral awareness narrows as attention locks onto the perceived source of urgency. This state feels alive. It can feel empowering. Because it often arrives clothed in moral or protective language, it can feel justified. The body does not register instigation as manipulation. It registers it as important. Instigation exploits a fundamental biological bias. The nervous system prioritizes motion over meaning when threat or opportunity feels imminent. Evolutionarily, this makes sense. In environments where delay could be fatal, immediate response increased survival. But in modern perceptual fields, saturated with language, media, and symbolic signals, this same mechanism can be activated without physical danger ever being present. Instigation is the mobilization of survival energy in response to a symbolic threat. Once mobilized, cognition follows the body's lead. Thoughts begin racing to catch up with the felt urgency. Interpretations form rapidly, often borrowing from existing beliefs already hardened into the ground. The mind does not pause to evaluate whether the spark warrants the reaction. It assumes that if the body is activated, there must be a reason. This is how motion precedes meaning. Instigation does not need to persuade you. It needs only to move you. Once movement has begun, direction becomes easier to influence. This is why instigation is most effective in environments where dogmatism has already done its work. Where beliefs are stable, identity is fused, and nuance has been reduced. Instigation does not encounter resistance. It encounters readiness. The field is primed. In such environments, even small sparks can produce large reactions. A headline, a rumor, a moralist anecdote, a single emotionally charged phrase repeated across multiple voices. Each repetition adds heat, reinforcing the sense that urgency is shared, that action is collective, that delay is dangerous. The individual nervous system synchronizes with the collective field. What begins as internal activation quickly becomes social momentum. Instigation thrives on this synchronization. It feeds on the sense that everyone else feels this too. Agreement amplifies urgency. Dissent feels risky, not because it is wrong, but because it threatens to slow the group's movement. Slowing down in an instigated field feels like betrayal. This is one of the most insidious aspects of instigation. It reframes pause as danger. Reflection becomes hesitation. Hesitation becomes irresponsibility. The very mechanisms that allow thoughtful engagement are recast as obstacles to necessary action. In this way, instigation collapses the ineffable gap, the space between stimulus and response where choice resides. The gap does not disappear entirely. It narrows. Within a narrowed gap, reaction masquerades as agency. From the inside, the individual often feels compelled rather than coerced. The urge to act feels personal, authentic, even righteous. There is little awareness that the urgency itself has been installed. The focus remains on the perceived issue, not on the energetic state driving engagement. Instigation does not want you to notice your body. It wants you to stay focused on the signal. Because once attention turns inward, once breath is felt, posture is noticed, time is allowed to stretch, the spell begins to weaken. The nervous system recalibrates. Urgency softens. Space returns. This is why instigation accelerates conversation. This is why it rewards speed and why it frames delay as failure. The longer the body remains activated without discharge, the more difficult it becomes to access reflective cognition. Emotional energy seeks release, and action becomes the most immediate outlet. The content of that action matters less than the fact that movement occurs. Instigation at its core is not about outcomes. It is about momentum. Momentum once established carries its own logic. This is how individuals and groups find themselves acting in ways they later struggle to explain, not because they were deceived, but because they were mobilized. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because their nervous systems were recruited before meaning could stabilize. Instigation leaves a distinctive aftertaste. Once the energy dissipates, there is often a sense of confusion, a question, a subtle recognition that something moved too quickly. The body relaxes, but the mind searches for justification. Rationalizations appear, retrofitting meaning onto actions already taken. This retroactive reasoning further obscures the original mechanism. Instigation disappears behind the story it helped generate. Because the story feels coherent, the energetic manipulation that preceded it often goes unnoticed. As we move deeper into this episode, we will slow the process down. We will examine the cognitive hooks that allow instigation to bypass reflection, the somatic receipts that signal its presence, and the field dynamics that amplify its effects. But for now, remain with the sensation of activation itself. Notice how quickly energy can rise without direction. Notice how urgency can feel like clarity. Notice how motion can begin before meaning has fully arrived. This is the spark in the dry field. Once you learn to feel it, it becomes much harder to mistake heat for truth. Etymology and definitions. Instigation as acoustic motion. How language learns to move the body. Instigation is often misunderstood because it is rarely examined at the level where it actually operates. It is not an argument. It is not a belief. It is not even, strictly speaking, an idea. Instigation is a movement event. To understand it properly, we must step away from language as meaning and approach it as structure, as a signal, as a force capable of reorganizing the nervous system before interpretation has time to form. This is the central premise of the mirror-linguistic hypothesis. Language does not merely describe reality. It mirrors the field into the body. The word instigation comes from the Latin instigare, to incite, to urge forward, to provoke movement. Embedded in the term is the image of a prod or spur, a minimal stimulus applied not to guide direction, but to initiate motion. This image matters more than its definition. A spur does not tell the body where to go. It tells the body to move. From an MLH perspective, this is the defining feature of instigation. It does not install content. It injects kinetic charge. It introduces motion into a perceptual field that has already been stabilized by earlier linguistic saturation. By the time instigation appears, the field is already coherent. Propaganda has shaped the environment. Dogmatism has hardened belief. Identity has aligned with interpretation. Instigation arrives after coherence, not before it. This is why it works. Historically, instigation was recognized as a distinct act precisely because it diffused responsibility. To instigate was not to command, but to catalyze. Action followed, but agency appeared to remain with the individual. The instigator did not push. They activated conditions under which movement felt necessary. From a field theory standpoint, this is critical. Instigation does not operate at the level of individual persuasion. It operates at the level of field activation. It introduces a frequency shift into the environment, a rise in emotional amplitude, urgency, or agitation that the nervous systems within that field begin to mirror automatically. This is collective entrainment. When a field becomes saturated with a particular linguistic tone, urgency, threat, outrage, or anticipation, individual nervous systems synchronize to that tone. Breath patterns align, attention narrows, temporal perception compresses. People begin reacting together, even if they believe they are responding independently. This is not metaphorical. It is biological. The brain is a prediction engine. It continuously updates its internal models based on environmental input. Repeated linguistic patterns, especially those carrying emotional charge, begin to hard-code expectations into neural architecture. This process is known within MLH as neurolinguistic mirroring. When urgency saturates the field, the brain predicts urgency. When threat saturates the field, the body prepares for threat. Instigation exploits this predictive loop. It does not need to convince the prefrontal cortex. It bypasses it. By the time conscious interpretation begins, the nervous system has already shifted state. The body has already received the message. This is why instigation is best understood as an acoustic strike. An acoustic strike is not defined by volume or aggression. It is defined by timing and frequency. Certain words, tones, and narrative framings act as direct triggers for autonomic mobilization. They collapse the ineffable gap, the space between stimulus and response where sovereignty resides. Instigation is the deployment of such strikes within an already entrained field. Words like urgent, now escalating, before it's too late and we can't afford to wait. These are not instructions. They are temporal weapons. They compress time. When time compresses, reflection loses relevance. The nervous system shifts from exploratory mode into survival logic. Action begins to feel safer than pause. Movement feels responsible. Stillness feels negligent. This is not because the individual is irrational. It is because the body has been moved. Instigation functions by altering the energetic state of the field, not the intellectual content within it. This is why it can mobilize people with vastly different beliefs simultaneously. The content they attach to the urgency may differ, but the activation is shared. From the inside, this activation feels like concern, or care, or moral responsibility. It may feel like being switched on or finally paying attention. and because it carries emotional heat, it often feels meaningful, but meaning is secondary. Instigation is motion without a map. Within the resonance matrix, we define instigation as the deliberate injection of linguistic energy into a stabilized field designed to mobilize autonomic response before cognitive meaning can stabilize. This definition places instigation precisely where it belongs, between belief and behavior. It is the bridge that turns certainty into momentum. It is important to understand that instigation does not require deception. In fact, it often works best when the information being circulated is partially true, emotionally resonant, or morally framed. What matters is not accuracy, but activation. Instigation introduces restless charge. The body begins to prepare for action. Breath shortens, muscles prime, attention locks forward. The nervous system enters a sympathetic dominant state, often oscillating with brief dorsal rigidity when overwhelm threatens. This oscillation creates urgency without discharge. Energy builds. The body wants resolution. This is the biological signature of instigation. They are state effects. Instigation leaves a somatic receipt whether or not it is consciously recognized. The body records the shift. It remembers the mobilization. And if instigation becomes habitual, the nervous system begins expecting it. Calm can start to feel unfamiliar. Stillness can feel unsafe. Recognizing this blueprint is not about suppressing activation. It is about restoring sequence. Sensation awareness, interpretation choice. When sensation is noticed early, when the tightening chest, the shortened breath, the restless energy are recognized as signals rather than commands, the ineffable gap begins to reopen. The nervous system gains time. The prefrontal cortex regains integrative capacity. Action becomes optional rather than compulsory. This is not control through force. It is regulation through awareness. It is also one of the most neurologically destabilizing dynamics a human nervous system can experience. Intermittent reinforcement trains vigilance. When the connection becomes unpredictable, the nervous system increases monitoring. Attention narrows. Hypervigilance emerges, not because the person is anxious by nature, but because safety has become inconsistent. Each return of warmth acts as a reward. Dopamine reinforces hope. The nervous system learns that if it stays alert enough, patient enough, accommodating enough, connection might return. This is not a weakness. It is conditioning. 5. The body's response: hypervigilance, and leaving as emotional presence continued to withdraw. The body responded appropriately. It stopped feeling safe. Hypervigilance increased. Relaxation became difficult. Being together without attunement felt draining rather than nourishing. Most of the time together occurred in the other person's environment. To outside observers, departures appeared sudden or unnecessary. The harm occurs in the nervous system, not in observable behavior. The injury is to perception, not reputation. And when someone tries to explain it, they are often met with confusion or skepticism. It doesn't sound that bad. Maybe you're reading into it. Are you sure? These responses further destabilize the internal reference point of the person experiencing harm. This is not because others are malicious. It is because they are interpreting behavior, not field dynamics. 7. Self-awareness without self-blame. A crucial aspect of this case is self-reflection. There was awareness of personal patterns, recognition of how withdrawal can occur when reciprocity is not met, and acknowledgement that no one shows up perfectly in relationships. This awareness matters. Healthy self-examination does not cause harm. In fact, it often sharpens perception. Being aware of one's attachment wounds does not mean one is imagining mistreatment. It means the nervous system may be especially sensitive to inconsistency and therefore more accurate in detecting it early. This is where many people become trapped. They confuse self-awareness with self-blame. Recognizing vulnerability does not negate external dynamics. It provides context for why certain patterns are especially destabilizing. 8. The trap: unable to explain, unable to stay. As the dynamic continued, the sense of being trapped intensified. Explaining felt impossible, staying felt unsafe. Leaving felt like abandonment, both of the other person and of oneself. This is the core bind of physiological abuse. The nervous system is activated, but the mind lacks language that others will validate. The person begins questioning their own reactions even as their body continues to signal danger. This is not irrationality. It is cognitive dissonance induced by relational instability. Eventually, clarity emerges not as certainty, but as exhaustion. The body reaches a threshold where continued exposure is no longer tolerable. Departure becomes the only viable form of regulation. When this happens, it is often framed externally as avoidance or instability. In reality, it is the nervous system choosing survival. 9. Why this matters. This case illustrates why instigation, withdrawal, and gaslighting are so destructive when combined. They do not rely on force. They rely on confusion. They do not overpower. They destabilize. Because the harm is physiological rather than visible, those affected are often left isolated, doubting themselves while appearing fine to others. This is why learning to trust somatic receipts is essential. The body knew something was wrong long before language could explain it. Leaving was not a failure of connection. It was a refusal to abandon oneself. 10. Closing the case. This field case is not presented to vilify another person. It is presented to make the invisible visible, to show how instigation operates in real relational contexts. If you recognize yourself in this pattern and have struggled to articulate it, know this: your body's signals were not irrational. Your confusion was not weakness. Your departure was not a failure. It was information. Learning to listen to that information is not paranoia. It is sovereignty. The sovereign shield, restoring internal reference without armoring sovereignty, does not arrive through vigilance. It does not emerge from scanning for threat, memorizing tactics, or hardening the self against future harm. Those responses, while understandable, belong to the same nervous system logic that instigation exploits. Readiness without rest. True sovereignty begins somewhere quieter. It begins with the restoration of internal reference, the capacity to feel what is happening inside before responding to what is happening outside. Not as a skill to be performed, but as a state that is remembered. After prolonged exposure to instigated fields, especially relational ones, the nervous system often remains partially mobilized even after the source has been removed. The body learns to anticipate disruption. Attention stays outward. Subtle cues are monitored. Silence feels suspicious. Calm feels temporary. This is not failure to heal. It is state persistence. The sovereign shield is not designed to block influence. It is designed to resequence perception, to restore the natural order in which sensation precedes interpretation and interpretation precedes action. This resequencing begins by reclaiming the ineffable gap. The ineffable gap is not a pause you force. It is a space that reopens when urgency is no longer obeyed automatically. In practical terms, this means learning to recognize the earliest signs of mobilization, not to suppress them, but to notice them without immediate response. The moment you feel the body lean forward, tighten, or accelerate, you are already inside the gap. That moment is sovereignty, not because you do nothing, but because you are no longer being moved without consent. One of the most important reframes here is this: safety is not the absence of threat. Safety is the presence of self-reference. When the internal reference is intact, external signals do not disappear. They simply lose their authority over timing. You can feel urgency without obeying it. You can register tension without resolving it immediately. You can notice withdrawal without chasing reconnection. This is not detachment. It is a regulated presence. The nervous system begins restoring ventral vagal tone not through reassurance, but through consistency. Small moments of staying with sensation without escalation rebuild trust in the body's signaling capacity. The system learns that it does not need to act to survive sensation. This is how hypervigilance unwinds, not by convincing yourself that nothing bad will happen, but by discovering that sensation itself is survivable without immediate action. The sovereign shield also involves recalibrating how meaning is assigned. Instigation thrives on premature interpretation. It encourages the mind to explain, justify, or resolve sensations before they have fully landed. Sovereignty reverses this order. First, sensation is allowed, then awareness stabilizes. Only then does meaning emerge. This process slows perception just enough to restore choice. Importantly, this does not mean distrusting others or second-guessing every interaction. That would simply invert the problem. Sovereignty is not suspicion. It is discernment without urgency. Discernment allows patterns to reveal themselves over time. It trusts repetition more than intensity. It notices consistency rather than reacting to single moments. It values how the body feels after interactions, not just during them. This is especially vital after experiences of relational instigation, where presence and absence were used to destabilize internal reference. In such cases, the body may initially confuse calm with danger or interpret neutrality as a threat. This is where patience becomes physiological medicine. Not patience with others, patience with your own nervous system as it relearns baseline safety. The sovereign shield is therefore not something you use. It is something you stand in. It emerges as you stop abandoning sensation in order to preserve connection, as you stop explaining yourself prematurely, as you stop rushing to resolve tension that is not yours to carry. Over time, this stance creates a subtle but powerful shift in relational fields. Instigative dynamics lose traction not because they are confronted, but because they fail to mobilize energy. Without urgency, their leverage collapses. This is not passivity. It is energetic non-cooperation. The final aspect of the sovereign shield is orientation toward wholeness rather than control. Instigation fragments perception. It pulls attention outward. It narrows focus. Sovereignty restores dimensionality. It allows multiple signals to coexist without forcing resolution. You can feel discomfort without assigning blame. You can sense withdrawal without chasing an explanation. You can recognize patterns without naming villains. This restores dignity, both yours and others, and it closes the loop. Because sovereignty is not about becoming impervious. It is about becoming unavailable to manipulation through urgency. When the body trusts itself again, language loses its capacity to bypass perception. Instigation becomes visible not as a threat, but as movement arriving too early. And when movement no longer precedes meaning, choice returns. Quietly, naturally, without force. Integration and orientation. When motion slows enough to be seen, instigation loses its power the moment it is recognized as movement rather than meaning. Not because urgency disappears, but because it is no longer mistaken for truth. By this stage in the episode, something subtle may already have shifted, not resolution but space. A recognition that many moments in life that felt decisive, pressing, or morally urgent were not driven by clarity, but by activation. This recognition does not invalidate what was felt. The nervous system responded appropriately to the signals it received. What changes now is not the response itself, but the sequence. Instead of signal, urgency, action, and justification, the sequence begins to restore itself as signal, sensation, awareness, and choice. This quiet reordering is the foundation of sovereignty. Instigation thrives when this order is reversed. When urgency leaps ahead of awareness, the body moves before meaning has time to settle. Once this pattern is seen clearly, it becomes far harder for it to operate invisibly. Importantly, this does not mean the world becomes calm. It means you do. Instigated fields continue to exist in the media, in relationships, in workplaces, in collective narratives. The difference is that they no longer recruit your nervous system automatically. Activation may still arise, but it no longer demands obedience. This is the difference between being affected and being entrained. The integration here is not intellectual. It is a temporal in function. You begin noticing when something feels rushed, when language accelerates, when tone carries pressure, when movement is demanded before orientation has occurred. And instead of reacting, you allow sensation to complete itself. Energy that is allowed to rise and fall without being hijacked does not need to discharge through impulsive action. It resolves internally. The body returns to baseline. Perception widens. Instigation relies on speed. Sovereignty relies on duration. When you stay long enough with sensation, clarity arrives naturally, not dramatic clarity, but grounded clarity, the kind that does not need action to validate itself. This is how internal reference is rebuilt. Myth debunked. If it was instigation, I would have noticed. One of the most persistent myths surrounding influence is this. If someone was instigating me, I would have noticed. This myth survives because it imagines manipulation as loud, aggressive, or intentional. In reality, the most effective instigation is ambient. It does not feel like pressure. It feels like relevance. It does not announce itself as urgent. It feels like responsibility. Instigation works precisely because it recruits healthy nervous system functions: alertness, care, responsiveness, and moral engagement. It does not override these capacities, it redirects them. This is why intelligent, reflective, ethical people are often more vulnerable to instigation, not less. Their systems respond deeply to cues of importance and consequence. When urgency is framed as care, they lean in, not because they are naive, but because they are human. Recognizing instigation is therefore not about suspicion. It is about timing awareness, noticing when something demands movement before it allows understanding. Instigation is not something you miss. It is something you host until you learn to feel it early enough to choose otherwise. From motion to misdirection, instigation is the final stage of environmental grooming. It prepares the nervous system for what comes next. Once energy is mobilized, perception becomes easier to shape. When urgency compresses time, accuracy becomes secondary. The body seeks resolution. The mind seeks coherence. This is where deception enters. Deception does not arrive as lies. It arrives as misalignment, a subtle souring of reality, an inconsistency that cannot be named, a sense that meaning no longer settles cleanly in the body. Where instigation compresses time, deception fractures trust. Trust in perception, trust in memory, trust in internal signals. In the next episode, we will examine how reality itself becomes destabilized, how words begin carrying an acrid aftertaste, how explanations feel close but never quite right, and how the nervous system struggles to find a place to land. But for now, we close gently. No action required. No conclusions demanded. No urgency imposed. Just this orientation. You are not obligated to move simply because something around you is moving. You are not irresponsible for pausing. You are not disengaged for waiting. You are not wrong for letting meaning arrive after sensation. Instigation only succeeds when time is stolen. And time once reclaimed returns choice. Until next time, stay with the moment before motion, the space where sensation is still yours, where language has not yet decided for you, and where sovereignty quietly lives. You've been listening to the Resonance Matrix Volume 2, The Linguistic Somatic Decode, Episode 3 Instigation. I'm James Miller.